And without further ado, I am going to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Mia Jackson, who is curator of decorative arts at Waddesdon Manor, the Rothschilds collection, where she has worked for 5 years. She has previously worked for English Heritage, for the Wallace Collection, and the Department of Prints Drawings at the British Museum. Mia wrote her doctoral thesis on the cabinet maker André Charles Boulle and his collection of works on paper. She is interested in the decorative arts in general and French ceramics and furniture in particular. Last year, she co-edited with Helen Jacobsen and Rufus Bird a book on the cabinet maker Jean-Henri Rustin, cabinet maker to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And she has recently curated the exhibition Alice's Wonderlands at Waddesdon Manor, a subject about which we will hear more today. So without further ado, I give you Mia Jackson. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Now then, let me just make sure I've got all my controls in order. Okay. So here is Alice outside Waddesdon Manor. I would like to start by saying that Alice owned Waddesdon for 24 years and owned the adjacent estate and pavilion of Ethrop for 48 years. She also had a London townhouse on Piccadilly and a villa in Grasse in the south of France from the mid-1880s. Yet circumstance has meant that it is the preservation of Waddesdon, built by her brother Ferdinand and inherited by Alice in 1898, for which she's most often remembered. The knowledge we already had about Alice's collection came from comparison between two probate inventories of Waddesdon's contents, taken one on Ferdinand's death in 1898 and two in 1922 when Alice died, which also included her pavilion at Ethrop, and we have kind of a numbering system to reflect that. So objects at Waddesdon have a W number and those at Ethrop have an E number, the numbers with which we internally refer to objects sometimes at Waddesdon. We have all sorts of numbers anyway. But we also know more about what Alice did at Waddesdon because she wrote a catalogue of the principal pictures, furniture, china, and other works of art in 2 editions, one in 1906 and one in 1910. Neither of those were published. They exist only in typescript form. But very little archival evidence survives about her collecting activity because most of her personal papers and most of those belonging to her brother were destroyed after their deaths. But in 2007, 144 receipts for objects purchased from art dealers were found, detailing Alice's purchases between the years of 1904 and 1918, and the descriptions were often precise enough to enable us to identify more objects. This snapshot of activity of 14 years after inheriting Waddesdon has given us much fuller knowledge of what Alice bought, from whom and for how much. My colleagues, in particular Rachel Jacobs and I, carried out further research on all of these receipts and documents in preparation for an exhibition about Alice as a collector, which took place this year to mark the centenary of Alice's death. And part of it, contrary to what the website says, will be on next year as well. Sorry. And that's Waddesdon, in case you'd forgotten what it looks like. It was the creation of Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild and his architect Hippolyte Détailleur. Ferdinand was from the Viennese branch of the Rothschild family, but moved to England at the age of 19 after the death of his English mother, obviously Alice's mother as well. He fell in love with his English cousin Evelina, with whom he married in 1865, but she sadly died in 1866. He also had a large townhouse on Piccadilly next door to Alice, and she bought the adjoining estate, Ethrop. So they were close, but they had their own kind of separate establishments, if you like. Waddesdon was built between 1874 and 1884 and it is inspired by the great chateaux of the Loire that date from the Renaissance. So this is the exhibition. This is the part of the exhibition that's going to continue next year. There are certain key rooms in Alice's houses that we can envisage better than others, either because the displays still exist or the objects do. At Waddesdon, the smoking room had contained Ferdinand's Renaissance Museum, which he left to the British Museum as the Waddesdon bequest. Alice collected objects for that room after the departure of the collection, but didn't just replace like with like. She made something new. She introduced Renaissance paintings, both religious and secular, and bought lots and lots of maiolica. This photo illustrates the exhibition at Waddesdon and shows the type of objects that Alice was collecting for the bachelor's wing at Waddesdon and the hall at Ethrop on the darker teal wall, and the type of objects she was adding to the largely 18th century displays in the main part of the manor on the paler blue wall. Alice and her brother Ferdinand loved exotic birds, and there were aviaries in their childhood homes and at Waddesdon. So it's not surprising that both of them bought Sèvres porcelain with bird decoration. Alice in particular liked Armand Lenné and bought 6 vases and 3 jardinières that he painted. Ferdinand bought the Razumovsky service, which included several pieces that are attributed to him and a single jardinière that are still at Waddesdon. But Alice bought these 2 vases on May 25th, 1907, when the dealer Charles Davis came for lunch at Waddesdon and she bought them for £3,250. I like to think that he came up on the train with them in a box and persuaded her to buy them there, but we don't have any evidence for that, obviously. Sometimes as well, it's possible to trace objects that she bought in sale catalogues, which reinforce the information given to us by the receipts. So this cuvette Mao was bought by Julius Goldschmidt at one of the Edouard Chappy sales in Paris in 1907 and sold to Alice in London 8 days later. And we don't know if Alice asked him to buy it for her or if he bought it on the understanding that she might want to buy it. But by that point, sale catalogues were quite often illustrated. And so it's quite possible that she could have either seen it in person or seen it illustrated and decided that she wanted to buy it. She often bought objects with which she then created or completed or invented or improved garnitures with objects from Ferdinand's collection. Most of you will know that this is the best object that she ever bought, in my opinion. The Sèvres plaques were made in 1758 for Madame de Pompadour after paintings by Jean-Jacques Bachelier of her dogs, Bébé and Mimi, and her birds. The plaques must have been bought at her post-mortem sale by Pierre-André Jacquemin, who was the commissaire-priseur, and they're described in his post-mortem sale catalogue. The rest of the box is stamped for 1773, so they were remounted later. We don't know if Alice actually knew that these were Madame de Pompadour's animals, but I think she would have been pleased if she did. And the plaques are again attributed to Armand Lenné. Alice bought the snuff box in 1904 from Goldschmidt's again for £1,425, which is around £75,000 in today's money, which, knowing what we know now about the object, is a bit of a bargain. It came from the Duke of Cambridge's sale, and he was a grandson of George III. His father was George III's 7th son, Prince Adolphus. This is quite a fabulous object. Many of you will be familiar with the version in the Wallace collection that has a chicken on the top. And it was used either to burn perfume pastilles, or possibly, even though this one hasn't got a chicken on it, to cook an egg. There are only 6 of them known, and 2 do have a chicken on the top, the rest don't. But what I think is really interesting about this is that Alice bought it from Charles Davis, but it actually came from the collection of her cousin, Caroline Blanche, Lady Lindsay, who was from the English branch of the Rothschild family. She was very influential in the art world and co-founded the Grosvenor Gallery with her husband, where artists such as Burne-Jones and Walter Crane sold their work. But she did, however, have a substantial collection of 18th century French objects that were sold after her death in 1912. And Alice bought it from the dealer Davis, who may have bought it in for her. These 2 vases à oreilles are part of the same garniture as the ship vase in the Wallace collection. The image below on the left shows how Alice displayed them in 1909 or 1910, when she had stereoscopic colour photographs of Waddesdon taken, in particular when inside the manor, of flowers and garnitures and new displays. So there are photographs of the smoking room, the billiard room corridor, and quite a lot of fun garnitures, as well as her own red sitting room, which I'll talk about later. Unless, that is, they are in this photo, which was commissioned by Ferdinand de Rothschild in 1897. You can see them very far away on the commode. And the problem with Ferdinand's inventory is that objects are very often very summarily described, and nothing in his inventory, bar possibly a pair of green vases, would match these, but it could be them. That it's definitely a pair of ear vases. Ferdinand also had in that room, just on top of the commode, you can see the secretaire you can see on the right. Ferdinand had a display of pink and green Sèvres objects, a pink and green elephant vase that had been made for Louis XV, and 2 pink and green orange boxes, orange tubs, which he planted up, which may have inspired Alice to buy this object, which she bought for £6,000 from J&S Goldschmidt in 1908. And interestingly enough, we also have a Minton copy of this jardinière, about which we don't know anything other than it looks the same as the Sèvres object, but it says Minton on the bottom. So did Alice have it made to make a pair? And I know some of the assembled audience have seen these vases and don't think that they're right, which is fine. But I decided to keep them in the presentation because I worked out from the 1910 version of her catalogue that she must have bought them to form a garniture with the Petit Verre ship vase at Waddesdon. She must have bought them at some point between 1906 and 1910, and there are a couple of candidates in the receipts which could describe these vases. Excuse their photograph. I took them out of a cupboard and couldn't find anywhere to put them, but on a Christmas table decorated with a snowy bonsai tree. But anyway, at least it's seasonal. There's the ship vase and its former owner, Annie York, who is the daughter of Anthony de Rothschild. And now it's displayed at Waddesdon with a pair of Petit Verre elephant vases that came from Edmond de Rothschild's collection. And I really enjoy kind of tracing these groupings of vases and seeing when collectors improve their garnitures or change their garnitures or decide that actually this pair of vases will make a better garniture than that pair of vases, and they end up getting rid of things and replacing them and upgrading them. This pair of 1763 vase du Plessis à Côte with a Bleu Nouveau ground are also by Armand, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will note that they have pretty much the same birds in their reserves as the Vincennes vase à oreille that I showed at the beginning. In the Alice exhibition, I put the two pairs of vases together in a case with the Madame de Pompadour snuff box, and there sprang the idea of doing an Armand exhibition, which will hopefully happen in 2024. An article of 1905 describes all the species that Alice kept at the aviary at Waddesdon. Amongst them, her two favourites, Jacko, the hyacinth macaw, and Polly, the red macaw, original naming there. She visited the aviaries twice a day when at Waddesdon, and she took the birds their meals on a fancy wicker tray. Alice also bought 3 green vases hollandais painted by Armand in 1764, and she adds those to her catalogue for 1910, in which she states that they came from Austria, though she bought them via J&S Goldschmidt in 1906. The red drawing room at Waddesdon usually houses the 2 Riesner chests of drawers that Alice bought, as well as these 3 vase à bâton rompu that you can see in underneath the big picture. Alice bought them at the same time as 2 glass coolers from the dealer Charles Davis for the enormous sum of £13,500 in 1913, which is more than £1.5 million in today's money. However, they're not really a garniture. The central vase is quite rare. The version of the shape that includes the diamond frieze around the bottom is only known in 4 examples, and only the one in the Royal Collection has a date letter for 1764. The 3 vases are the same shape, the same colour, and decorated with scenes by the same painter. But the 2 flanking vases, although the same size, are not a pair either. This one dates from 1767, but the other one dates from 1766. I particularly like the marine trophy on this one, which is painted by Bouteux and includes a map of Madagascar and Réunion. Alice bought many Bleu Nouveau and Bleu Lapis and green vases. These 2 vases à tête de bouc are inventoried in the Tower drawing room, where she made a garniture with the large blue vase that Ferdinand had bought from Madame Auger, shown here in one of the colour photos that Alice had commissioned. She notes that they came from Russia. Another speciality of Alice's Sèvres taste were mounted vases with neoclassical gilt bronze mounts, which were the speciality in the 18th century of the marchand mercier Durlacher. Alice bought 6 in total, as far as we know, from Durlacher, and showed them in the Tower drawing room with this large biscuit figure of Diana. One of the things that we did as part of the exhibition was recreate some of these wacky garnitures. We think that Alice created her own sitting room on the first floor at Waddesdon in the first decade of the 20th century. She had silks rewoven for it at Presles in Lyon in 1908, and it's mentioned in her 2 catalogues, but not in Ferdinand's inventory of 1898. It was next to her bedroom suite, which is now called the Fountain Bedroom, and it replaced, the red sitting room replaced the purple chintz bedroom and dressing room. The red sitting room showcased Alice's collection of 18th century art, combining her own acquisitions with some of her brother's pieces, which mostly came from his private suite of rooms. So there's quite a lot of drawings rather than big grand paintings. She did not, however, only start buying objects when she inherited Waddesdon in 1898. She already owned 3 houses of her own by that point. And you can see here the same chest of drawers that we saw in the red drawing room, which she purchased from the Hamilton Palace sale in 1882. And we don't know where it was kept before the creation of the sitting room. The room was dismantled by James and Dorothy de Rothschild after they inherited Waddesdon in 1922. But part of this season that has just finished, part of the exhibitions was a recreation of this room, or at least the parts of it that we can see from the 1910 photographs. I'm suspicious of this vase, but wanted to show it to you anyway. Again, bought from Goldschmidt and rather delightfully paired with a pair of nodding Chinese monkeys, if you can see on the little table to the left of the Riesner commode, which were brilliantly written up by Sylvia Vries in the Revue des Amis de Sèvres last year, that Ferdinand had in his tower drawing room. The receipts also in their own way help us date the photographs. So this vase, which you can see in the middle of the Riesner commode, in between the two candelabra, was bought for £5,250 from Charles Davis on May the 21st, 1910. And since it's in the photos, then that photo in particular must post-date it. So the photos must be from 1910 or later. Sorry. These marvelous Chantilly wall appliques came to Waddesdon 4 years ago from the private collection. They were in the pink bedroom in the probate inventory of 1922, which was Alice's bedroom, along with quite a lot of 18th century Meissen, including other parrots. Although we don't know much about what was in her houses at Piccadilly or Grasse, because there are no inventories, she seems to have mostly preferred Sèvres. These are not described in any inventory as Chantilly. She had a couple of Chantilly Caquemon pottery, little ones, and a Menacee scent bottle that was so described, but nothing else that was French porcelain that wasn't Sèvres. So now we're headed to Meissen for a while. We don't actually know if Alice acquired our two Japanese palace figures, because until 1933, they were not kept at the manor. Instead, they adorned the curio room at the dairy. They were, of course, modelled by Candler, and along with over 200 others, were sold off as duplicates from the collections in Dresden. The dairy curio room, which I'll talk about in more detail later, was pretty fabulous, but it wasn't inventoried at Ferdinand's death, nor do we have any photographs of it before 1898, nor do we have any real descriptions of it before 1900. The 1922 inventory is likewise not particularly detailed, but we do have a photograph which I'll show you later. Most of the, and sorry for black and white photos here, these need photographing in colour. Most of the Meissen porcelain animals at Waddesdon were inventoried in 1898, so we can assume that they were bought by Ferdinand, but we know that Alice acquired this pair of lion and lioness and added them to the displays in the morning room between 1906 and 1910. She also bought this pair of hoopoes, which are now displayed in the small library at Waddesdon, but were in a storeroom at Ethrop at Alice's death as long-beaked birds. The Ethrop inventory is difficult to interpret. It reads as though the pavilion was still set up for people to visit and that displays were intact and meant for viewing, but we don't know what it looked like before Alice inherited Waddesdon. Did inheriting Waddesdon make her buy new types of objects, such as arms and armour and maiolica, or had she been buying and displaying them before then at Ethrop? There's virtually no Sèvres at Ethrop in 1922, but is that because there never was any Sèvres, or Meissen, for example, or because Alice took it all over to Waddesdon? Until some account of the collections at Ethrop appear, we can only surmise. Alice may have thought this to be a figure of Minerva, representations of whom she often purchased in objects such as Limoges enamels, It's actually a representation of fortitude made at Meissen in about 1760, and it would have originally been part of a table centerpiece. It has the letters BB on its base to locate it in relation to the other parts of the centerpiece. We don't know when she bought it, but she entrusted Charles Davis, who was kind of her go-to man for China, I think, with its restoration in 1910. She also had a number of these smaller figures, sometimes scent bottles, sometimes not. She bought one of our Meissen clocks, and indeed bought quite a few mounted porcelain clocks, and also bought Meissen figure groups, which ones with people don't seem to have interested Ferdinand as much. He likes the animals on gilt bronze bases. This Monteith and pair of ice cream coolers are inventoried in a storeroom at Ethrop in isolation, i.e. not part of a larger service. So if anybody's seen where the rest might be, I'd be interested to know, especially for my exotic bird hobby horse. Alice also had lots of dogs. There are 14 dog beds listed in her inventories, many of whom seem to have been pugs or similar. So she often acquired things in the shape of pugs, and this pair of what are described as sweetmeat boxes are a good example of that. Her personal seal, which is on display. Oh, did somebody say dogs? Her personal seal is in the shape of a golden pug sitting on top of a lapis cushion, which you can see in the treasury at Waddesdon. I've never really seen porcelain playing cards before, and I don't think that they are particularly practical, but Alice displayed these in the smoking room as a curiosity. They're thought to be Dr., and I'd be interested to know if anybody's seen any others. In terms of Oriental porcelain, Alice was not not as prolific a collector as her brother, we don't think, who largely preferred Eastern porcelain mounted in France in the 18th century, so relatively plain coloured objects. But ever in keeping with the extraordinary number of objects in the shape of birds or animals, she bought both these Chinese eagle incense burners and this Japanese ewer. Now on to maiolica. Ferdinand collected but 9 pieces of maiolica, which were bequeathed to the British Museum as part of the Waddesdon bequest, and 6 of those were white ground pieces decorated with grotesques from Urbino, and quite often after prints by Jacques-André du Cerceau. There isn't anything wrong with that, of course, but Alice's taste for maiolica was much more wide-ranging. The maiolica at Waddesdon has been extensively worked on by John Mallet and Diana Stone, who put on an exhibition in 2011. So I just want to share with you some of the highlights, bearing in mind that this is not my subject at all, but I thought I'd show you anyway. Maiolica was displayed at both Waddesdon, mainly in the smoking room, and at Ethrop. And there are now more than 60 pieces of Italian maiolica at Waddesdon, the vast majority of which were acquired by Alice. This dish is dated 1573 and was sold at Christie's in 1871 in the Castellani sale. Presumably it had an owner between then and Alice, and it may have been made in Lazio. Alice bought this dish in Paris from Seligman, and Rachel and I particularly liked it because we liked the note on the receipt which said, I can deliver this to your butler next time I'm in London. It depicts Moses calling down the manna from heaven whilst the Israelites collect it into jars and baskets. It came from the celebrated Fountain collection, which was sold by Christie's in 1884, although Alice bought it over 20 years later, and it was made in Urbino in around 1560. These dishes depict 2 of the censers after prints made by Raphael Sadler after Martin de Vos. And Alice acquired them from Durlacher brothers. She acquired a lot of her maiolica from the Durlachers, who were at 142 Bond Street. And these 2 plates cost her £60. And this spectacular vase, so you can see the front and the back of the vase, and it's got a nice wonk on it, was bought by Alice from Charles Davis. The main scene depicts Moses striking the rock with Israelites collecting water, and it is also from a mid 16th century. The receipt in which it's mentioned from Charles Davis is quite nice, because it shows that she wasn't just buying one type of object at a time. Like, she didn't go out on just a maiolica shopping trip. So when she bought this vase, she bought a vase, 2 plates, 1 maiolica, 1 Venetian glass, a head of a Madonna, and a portrait from Baron Arthur de Rothschild, which we think is probably the portrait of the infant Duc de Montpensier by Boucher. So quite a sort of wide array of objects to buy in one day from one person. And this charming dish may have been made to celebrate a wedding, and was bought by Alice from Durlacher Brothers as a Gubbio betrothal plate in 1906, and dates from between 1530 and 40. This dish, which I particularly like, was made in the town of Durlacher, and shows a male portrait, and in that diverts from the more usual dishes depicting portraits of beautiful women. But Alice obviously understood the link between this and the belle donne dishes on show in the smoking room, as her probate inventory shows that she displayed them as a group, and she purchased it at the same time as 2 of that group. The man is lavishly dressed, but it's unknown whether or not he's the portrait of a real person. She paid £800 for it in 1913, when it was sold to her with a companion plate, which it may actually be a pair, or they may have been put together by the dealers Durlacher. And then this rather lovely boot made in Faenza in the workshops of Don Pino in 1570 to 1580, and his mark is on the sole of the boot. And a very similar object is listed in the sale catalogue of the Hamilton Palace collection in 1882, and we're not sure whether or not that's our one, or if there's any way of knowing whether or not that's our one. I think the Ashmolean have acquired one in the last decade too. So this is a drawing of Ethrop done in 1885, so before Alice inherited Waddesdon. It was drawn by Alice's governess and friend Cecile Hoffer. Alice referred to Ethrop as her little cottage, but she never slept there after a doctor advised her that it was too near the river and the dampness would be bad for her chest. It did, however, have 2 bedrooms and a farm, and Alice took visitors there from Waddesdon by pony trap for the afternoon. It housed an eclectic mix of pottery, amongst other things. And this is a happy lion. He was inventoried at the farm at Ethrop in 1922 in a subsection called statuary belonging to garden, which implies that objects were either stored there when Alice was away, she was on her way back from Grasse when she died in May 1922, or that the gardens at Ethrop were less decorated after she inherited Waddesdon. And this plaque, as well as 2 others in the collection, were made in what is now Hungary or Western Slovakia, but in the 18th century formed part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by the Habsburgs, who are depicted on the 2 smaller plaques. The ceramic decorators from this area were descended from 17th century Anabaptist refugees from the Netherlands, and this object was at Ethrop, and it bears a label on the back suggesting that it was bought from Chaumont, dealers in objets d'art on Boulevard Haussmann in Paris. Disappointingly, this is probably not a real bit of Palissy, but made by 19th century Palissy fans from Tours. It was shown at the however, at the 1857 Manchester Art Treasures exhibition as genuine Palissy ware, which must be quite soon after it was probably made. And at that point, it belonged to Lord Hastings of Melton Constable, and this was displayed at Ethrop. And you can see that it's very useful when people don't wash stickers off the bottom of things. This hock breck, as I discovered on Friday, virtually identical to one in the Bayerisches Nationalmuseum in Munich. And I thank Katharina Hanschmann for her helpful correspondence and look forward to further investigation together. It's faience, and it was made at Kunersberg in 1760, or was made earlier and painted in Augsburg by a Hausmaler painter in 1750. The hollows is a gaming board, and the hollows are for coins, but the names relate to cards, and you can win the coins if you get the cards. I'm not very good at games, but I think I kind of generally understand the principle. Alice also seemed to have a great interest in English pottery, and there are all sorts of unexpected things to be found in Waddesdon's basements, such as this posthumous royalist dish commemorating Charles I. Alice displayed this high on the wall of the hall at Ethrop. We know this because the probate inventory states that the value is approximate because it's out of reach. The lazy probate inventors. And it was displayed with the 3 slipware dishes which follow, all of which display allegiance to the crown in the 17th century. Not much is known about the Staffordshire potter Thomas Toft, by whom around 30 signed dishes are known. His large chargers were probably intended to be hung on a wall as decoration and are prominently signed to serve as advertisements. They were first acquired by museums and collectors as interesting examples of everyday pottery, but in the late 19th century started to be appreciated as folk art. This dish depicts the Duke of York, later James II, who was deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 after being on the throne for only 3 years. And this dish is decorated with the royal arms, crest and supporters, lion and unicorn, and the cipher of Charles II. 7 dishes by Thomas Toft have this decoration, but only this one and the one in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas have the correct, more complex arms. It's been suggested in the big book on slipware by Ronald Cooper that Waddesdon's charger was the first to be made in the group. It was fired in the kiln vertically and has partly collapsed and warped owing to its enormous weight. Although Thomas Toft is the best known of the Staffordshire potters, making large slipware chargers, a number of other potters also signed dishes. Alice had very wide-ranging tastes in ceramics. The most usual type of ceramics bought by the many members of the Rothschild family were refined porcelains, either European, particularly Sèvres and Meissen, or Chinese or Japanese, with Alice's French cousins also sharing her taste for maiolica. Alice, however, branched out. So this is the curio room at the dairy, which I'd love to be able to attribute to Alice, but it was certainly in existence in 1900, 2 years after Ferdinand's death, when the Jewish Chronicle reported that the dairy is almost the most delightful place conceivable on a hot day, with its heavy roof and veranda, and great pans of cool milk and cream. Just adjacent is the dairy room, where visitors are often regaled with strawberries and cream. Sorry, I'm just going to eject this dog. Go on. Get out. Sorry. The lower part of the walls are panelled with rich carvings, whilst on the walls is a collection of quaint and fanciful china. None of the chairs are alike. 2 have for backs carvings in the form of man's faces. The spade with which the Queen planted a tree 10 years ago hangs on the wall. Curious are the plates filled with realistic china fruit, the old English and foreign jugs and plates. And we know where most of those objects are. In a 1909 Country Life article, the author proclaimed, "The little tea room adjoining the dairy is a treasure house of what is beautiful, curious, or ancient. It affords another proof of the care taken by Miss Alice de Rothschild that her visitors shall never want objects to interest them in whatever part they may lie." And what I really love about the curio room is this crazy mixture of, you have the Dresden turkey, you have the Meissen turkey from the Japanese palace, and the Meissen goat, flanked by what look like kind of English stoneware tortoises, Toby jugs and bear jugs, with these pieces of furniture made out of antlers and these amazing carved panels. And most of these objects we still have, not all of them, but a lot of them we still have, but the space doesn't exist anymore. Here are some curio room refugees. You would have seen them on the mantelpiece. Along with bear jugs, there were also lots of Rhineland jugs, many of which were sold in the 1960s and 70s by Dorothy de Rothschilds, who had no space for them. And you may remember that Errol Manners had one last year at Masterpiece. We've still got about 10, but in the inventory, they're just described as 15 jugs, which is very frustrating. And also at the dairy were a Wealden dovecote and some Delft birdcage plaques to remind you of Alice's interest in bird keeping. And I saw this at the Fitzwilliam Museum a few months ago and realised that the mysteriously described earthenware bear Atkinson sign at Ethrop Farm in 1922 was probably a bear advertising bear grease, such as this one. And then last but by no means least, Hugh Munro was a British soldier who was killed by a tiger when he went deer hunting in the forests of Surgur Island off the coast of Kolkata in India in 1791. And another depiction of a soldier being killed by a tiger is the fabulous, almost life-size wooden automaton known as Tipu's tiger, now in the V&A. Tipu Sultan, ruler of Mysore, was known as the Tiger of Mysore, and he adopted the animal as his symbol. When he was defeated by the British, his possessions were looted, and Tipu's tiger came to the East India Museum in London, where it became hugely popular. The potter, who's often named as Obadiah Sherratt, was probably inspired by this famous object. It was inventoried at the farm at Ethrop in 1922 with other pottery, suggesting that the farm may have been part of the visitor route taken by Alice's guests as a rustic location for admiring objects. And I think that the farm at Ethrop may have functioned in a similar way to the curio room at the dairy, but we don't have any surviving images of it. We have inventories, but we don't know how objects were arranged. But it had pottery, wooden stag heads, carved wooden brackets, animals made out of carved wood and covered in hide with horns, etc., and this marvelous tiger group. And to finish off, here is some rogue curating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mia. That was incredibly interesting and very thought-provoking. And I was just amazed at seeing the wealth of interests that Alice seemed to have and how much of a personality she seemed to have when it came to collecting and curating her own collections. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about her personality, what we know about her. Is there much that we can say about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult to find her voice, if you understand what I mean, because not very many letters survive. Unlike her brother, she didn't write her reminiscences. She didn't keep a diary, or if she did, we've never found it. We've got some letters from her early life, and she's quite serious and intense and really into Goethe, which, you know, I like that in a person. But she seems to be kind of possessed of a remarkable sort of independence of mind and of spirit. She doesn't get married. She doesn't seem to feel as though she ought to get married. She lives her life as she wishes, going between the south of France and London, Waddesdon and Ethrop. She just seems to do what she wants to do, and I really admire her for that.
Yes, very inspiring, actually, as a model and what to do. We have a few questions here. We're starting to get the questions. Jeffrey Ruda is thanking you for the wonderful lecture. And he's saying there was no FPS in Alice's day, but was collecting in any way a social or interactive experience for her, or was she very autonomous?
I'm not quite sure, and that's a really good question. But basically, from lack of evidence, we don't know. I found a nice quotation from the 1880s about her going kind of tramping the streets of around Bond Street looking for Sèvres with Ferdinand and her cousin Alfred. But in terms of whether or not she discussed her collection with people outside of the family, I mean, she must have done in social situations, but as yet we haven't found any correspondence where she's talking to other people about what they're buying. It's not like, for example, Charlotte Schreiber, where at least you have her diary, her journal of what she was buying. So that's the difficult thing with Alice, is that quite honestly we don't know, because we just don't have the evidence.
Yeah, no, that is quite interesting. I was wondering if she would be part of a wider group as well, because it seems to be kept everything in the family, isn't it, as you say? Yeah, quite interesting. And when you mentioned that they had a house in Piccadilly, and of course, Piccadilly seemed to be this hub for, well, very wealthy individuals, and they had great collections. So I was wondering if by the time they were around those properties in Piccadilly, they could meet somewhere at some club or at some social.
I mean, it's quite, apart from Alfred's house at Seymour Place and some other Rothschild houses. Basically, we don't know very much about Alice's house at Piccadilly or Ferdinand's house at Piccadilly, because neither of them left an inventory. But we can assume that they were relatively sociable as a family, and with members of their circle in and around their London houses, as well as their country retreats. Yeah,
thank you. Pamela Rutti is asking us, she's thanking you, and she says, that was fascinating. Was it Alice who collected the 18th century trade labels that are at Waddesdon?
No, it wasn't. It was Ferdinand. But I often think that Alice's way of collecting pottery is in some way sort of like Alice seems to collect ceramics in the way that Ferdinand collects prints to document kind of the history of everyday life almost. Alice also had some really interesting collecting predilections. She had a very large collection of pipes, made of all different materials, tobacco pipes, smoking pipes, even though apparently she hated smoking, which she kept at her house in Grasse, and which got bequeathed to the town of Grasse after her death. So they've the Bibliothèque Municipale at Grasse has still got this incredible collection of pipes collected by Alice de Rothschild. But she also collected, and this is why I'm telling this story, because it made me think of the trade cards. She also collected matchboxes. So the matchboxes, the kind of the pottery, that there's a big interest in kind of the everyday that I think Ferdinand maybe indulges by collecting prints, but Alice collects objects.
And do you think there is some kind of sense of humor, or is this fun around it?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you've only got to look at a bear jug to laugh.
Well, yes. Yeah, exactly. We have another question here from Adrian. Did Miss Alice have anyone working for her, or do curatorial things in all those locations, or just the household staff?
So I think for the most part it was the household staff, but she also had she had a couple of female companions who may or may not have been paid companions, not quite sure. But when it came to arranging the china, she often called in Charles Davis to do that, particularly at Waddesdon. So she not only would charge him with restoring items, but also trusted him to arrange her china as well. And kind of, so obviously this was a sort of an activity that she wanted help and guidance with, and Davis was the person who helped her with that. But so quite often one of the stories that everybody likes about Alice is how strict she was about handling of objects, and about people touching objects and light damaging objects. And it's often said that her rules, Miss Alice's rules, were the basis of the National Trust's conservation handbook. Now, the rules aren't written down anywhere from Alice's lifetime. It's largely thanks to hearsay from Dorothy that we have Miss Alice's rules. So Dorothy knew Alice. By the time she met her, Alice already would have been quite elderly. They probably met in about 1910, I should imagine. And I'm not saying that Dorothy isn't a reliable witness, but Dorothy was very young at that point, and Alice may have seemed quite scary. They're all very sensible rules, like don't talk when you're handling porcelain. That I'm not very good at obeying that rule. But it's do you see what I mean? There's always a bit of an effort to characterize her as a frightening person, as a fierce person. But I think that actually she was probably quite funny.
Yeah, well, as we said, she definitely must have had a sense of humor if she was collecting these very wacky objects and having fun displaying them. And with in relation to displaying them, as you said, when she was seeking advice from Davis, I had a question about all these interchanges and recreations of garnitures. That is something that's fascinating. And so do you think this is something that would have been the norm, or as in, if you have a vase, you always would try to pair it with something that is similar, or try to complete something that looks like a garniture? Is this a 19th century activity, or would this have been originally
yeah, I think well, I think it's definitely a 19th century activity. From certainly from what I've read about the Rothschilds, it seems to me that they were always trying to kind of improve on their garnitures, but that they weren't sort of embarrassed by the idea that they might be putting a pair of 1773 vases with a 1761 vase. If they thought that they went nicely together, fair enough. And there seems to be a sort of a liberty about it, and a sort of a lack of historical accuracy that shows that they were just enjoying their objects for what they were, and enjoying kind of making these groupings and making these arrangements, which I think is really interesting. And one of the things that I became interested in with Alice is sort of tracing these different garnitures and which vases replace which vases at other points and so on. And Ferdinand actually talks about it quite interestingly in an essay, when he talks about a pair of elephant vases that he later discovers to have been Minton, and it turns out that his cousin buys them from a dealer and finds out they're Minton, and Ferdinand thinks that this is hilarious because he never thought to turn them over and check whether or not they were Minton, but he gives them back to the dealer specifically because he's found a better pair to replace them, to flank a kind of a star central piece. So yeah, I think it's kind of in a bit of a constant state of trying to make the best garnitures possible.
Yes, state of flux, and
trying
to outdo themselves.
Yeah, and sometimes the same garnitures are kept for several years, but if they see something that they think goes better with a ship vase or whatever, then that will happen.
Yes. That sounds fun, actually, as an activity. We have some more questions. We have a question from Lynn Springer, who is saying, what was the extent of Alice's library pertaining to various categories of decorative arts?
The short answer to that is I'm afraid that we don't know, because the books are... so we don't know what books she had at Ethrop, and we don't know what books she had at Piccadilly, and books that are kind of collection books are inventoried at Waddesdon, but there are quite a lot of books that are still in the collections at Waddesdon or in the private collection that were published in Alice's lifetime that we think she may have acquired, but we don't know, because they also could have come via the English branch, and hence via another branch of the family. So I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, that proves what you have been showing us, and also with this exhibition, that there is constant research, constant new things to discover, as this comment by John Mallet, who is saying that there seems to be much more archival material that has come up, or more research that has come up. And John is also asking, he says, I wonder how Alice knew she was collecting Armand Aîné before the crescent mark was identified.
Oh, I don't think she did. I think it's just a happy serendipity that she ended up buying so much Armand. But he was called the Crescent Painter, and sort of identified as somebody worth collecting before Bernard discovered that he was Armand. But yes, John, since the discovery of those receipts, there's been quite a lot of staring cross-eyedly at them and trying to match them up with objects, and I would love to talk to you more about it, because I'm sure you'd be able to make much more sense of it than I have been able to, certainly for maiolica. I don't know anything about maiolica.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we are going to conclude there since we don't have any more questions and it's over 7. And we just wanted to thank our wonderful speaker, Dr. Mia Jackson, for this fascinating talk. I wonder if you want to invite everyone to go over for Christmas, or is that going to be too much?
Oh yeah, if you want to join the kind of 110,000 other people who are currently driving past my house to go and look at sparkly things, please feel free. And if you do, then maybe we could sneak behind the scenes and go and look at some Alice objects together.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Mia. I may join that group of people, actually. Why not?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for coming. It's very kind of you to give up your Sunday evenings.
Well, thank you, Mia, and thank you everyone who have been listening. This is our last lecture of the year, so we just want to thank everyone for the support over the year and to wish everyone a wonderful holiday season. And we will be back in January with more lectures, so keep your eyes peeled and we will send more information about it soon. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of the evening.
Thank you.